Hi everyone. We're going to get started. So my name is Emma Jones, and I will be introducing the survey that we used for this talk and the methods that we used to obtain the data.
The universe really doesn't want us to have this conversation. Every single tech thing that could go wrong has gone wrong. I'll go up there.
Well, thank you. I'll run up there. All right. In an effort to bring light to this hugely negative impact that pornography has had on our culture and the urgency to fix it, WDI USA's anti-pornography working group created an anonymous survey to gather women's stories of all ages and backgrounds. While we're focused on legislation in the US, women of all ages, we urged women of all nations to share their stories, as we hope these stories will be able to change the minds worldwide and help them pass anti-porn legislation in their respective countries. From our anti-pornography mission statement, women and girls have the right to participate in society without the consequences of being in a society corrupted by pornography-induced desensitization. Article 8 of the Declaration emphasizes the need for the elimination of violence against women, noting that violence against women is one of the crucial social mechanisms by which women as a sex are forced into a subordinate position compared to men as a sex. Exposure to pornography, fueled violence, and harassment directly undermines women and girls' ability to engage fully and equally in civic and social life. It leads to the assumption and conclusion that girls and women's bodies are always for sale. Furthermore, pornography, which frequently portrays women as victims in violent and degrading scenarios, normalizes and perpetuates violence against women, thereby fueling the demand for prostituted and trafficked women and girls. The cycle of violence and exploitation underscores the urgent need to address pornography, prostitution, and sex trafficking as interconnected issues that violate women's fundamental human rights. The Declaration calls for the collection of sex disaggregated data on violence against women, which is essential for understanding the full scope of the harm caused by pornography, prostitution, and sex trafficking. The survey itself, titled "How Has Pornography Impacted Your Life?" contained only two mandatory questions. What is your sex? And what is your story? Optional questions were age and country of origin. Respondents were recruited via email and social media, as well as word of mouth. It was publicized through several channels associated with our organization. Email blurbs were sent to American and international support. I myself appeared on an online webinar, Feminist Question Time, hosted by WDI to discuss the project and encourage webinar viewers to submit responses. We used social media sites such as Instagram, Facebook, and Reddit, and over it to encourage women to participate. We had the survey open throughout the month of March 2025. 118 responses were received. Of these, 5 were removed due to being spam or being submitted by male respondents, leaving 113. Respondents were mostly from US and Canada, but a few from other countries. My fellow panelists will take us through key patterns we found throughout the survey and notable responses. We will also be discussing what we will plan to do with our findings to further the fight protecting women against sexual violence and objectification. Please be aware, in the following section, we will be reading some of the responses, and while we are only highlighting certain aspects, to be respectful and to not trigger and the testimonies may be triggering, even though we're trying to be respectful. Now that you have a background in the methodology, Forest Romm will speak of CSA and the connection to pornography.
Hi everybody. So it's very loud. Okay, yeah, I'm Forest Romm. I am going to be talking about CSA as it relates to pornography. So among the 113 women who shared their stories with us, 39 of them disclosed experiences of childhood sexual abuse. There were also others that alluded to that experience but didn't disclose it directly. So their experiences aren't included in the analysis, which means that there are probably more respondents who experienced CSA than those who reported it to us. The experiences varied that were reported, but there were clear patterns that emerged throughout the data. For example, roughly 40% of respondents who experienced CSA were abused by family members, and over 60% experienced physical sexual abuse, while more than 13% were exposed to pornography as part of the grooming leading up to or the actual content of their abuse. And then something that was very interesting was that around 44% of these respondents described a form of abuse that is pretty much entirely overlooked. We had a lot of discussions about this, but it's being exposed to pornography at an early age as abuse itself, even without any physical contact involved. So despite the unique details of each woman's experience, every CSA survivor who reported their experience to us described a clear connection between pornography and their abuse. For some of these women, the link was clear but unconfirmed. An example is a Canadian woman between the ages of 35 to 44 who wrote about her childhood abuse. She said, "As a child, I was molested by my babysitter's son. I was 8 or 9. He would take me to the woods. His first move was to make me choke on his penis. The second was to anally abuse me. He was a teen. Where did he learn this?" For other women, the connection was confirmed by the abuser himself. For instance, a woman wrote to us who's between 25 to 34 years old from Germany, and she said, "I'm a lesbian and was raped and trafficked by a porn addict when I was 15. He had many strange ideas about girls my age and claimed every man secretly wants to date a child. When I asked where that came from, he said he got these ideas from porn." For the women who reported being forced to watch pornography as part of grooming or physical abuse, the link was very, very undeniable. So consider an American woman between 25 to 34 years old who recalled her abuse. She said, "I was first exposed to pornography by my stepfather at the age of 11 years old. In order to be allowed to ride my bike and play with my friends, I would first have to watch porn. Eventually, my porn-sick stepfather escalated his behavior into molesting me. He recorded it and uploaded it to the internet. Child pornography of me is still probably on the dark web somewhere to this day." Another woman who is a teenager from Canada wrote, "When I was 11, I was introduced to porn by my groomer, and they would use it to teach me how to do things they wanted of me." So when pornography itself is the abuse without physical contact, it sort of slips through the cracks of both cultural and clinical awareness. We really don't have language developed yet to talk about this kind of abuse. Many of the women reported early childhood exposure to pornography at the hands of their fathers, both intentionally and accidentally. For example, there was one woman from the US between 45 and 55 years old who pretty vividly described how her exposure against her father led to a cycle of what I would call something like incestuous degradation, for lack of a more specific term. But she said about her father, she said, "My father was extremely violent and a consumer of pornography. He would point out women's body parts in porn magazines and on TV, telling my sister and me we'd be lucky if we grew up to have tits like this or an ass like that. He constantly told us what a woman's body should look like to make a man happy. He compared my mom's body to porn models and said things like, 'Your mom's too flat. That doesn't do anything for a man.' My mom internalized this, joked about it, and acted like it didn't matter because she was so far outside the range of what counted as female. It's hard to even describe how damaging that was." So this kind of harm is rampant, but almost, like I said before, entirely ignored in mainstream academic, psychological, and legal discourse. The women who experienced it described years of their life struggling with post-traumatic stress symptoms as a result of exposure without physical contact. The survey made a few things clear. First, as many of us know and have long suspected, pornography is an instrument of violence towards women. It's very deeply implicated in CSA, and early exposure is itself a kind of sexual abuse regardless of physical contact. So there are a few things that we can take away. As feminists, we need to develop language for discussing the very distinct types of pornography-related abuse. And we, of course, need to encourage others to stop being passive consumers of pornography, because there really is no such thing. Very importantly, we really need to dismantle the notion once and for all that consent is a sufficient metric or a sufficient standard for determining whether or not pornography causes harm, because we need to ask whose stories we're leaving in the dark when we frame pornography only as a matter of adult choice or sexual freedom. And with that, I am going to share the time with Donna, who is going to discuss how pornography affects women's relationships.
Hello? Can you hear me? Is this, okay.
It's not on. It's not on, or we're not close enough.
What was that?
It's either not on or not close enough.
Oh. Okay, how's that?
Better.
Okay, real close. Okay. One of the most frequent comments about how pornography affected the respondents' lives was to talk about their relationships. Okay, 51 or 45% of the respondents wrote that pornography negatively affected their relationships with boyfriends, partners, or husbands. No respondent said that pornography had a positive effect on their relationship. First thing that the women talked about was addiction. And let's see. Yes, 22 of the women, or 19% of the respondents, said that their partner's addiction affected their relationship. The result of their addiction, the men's addiction, was erectile dysfunction, in which men cannot perform sexually. One woman wrote, "My husband was addicted to pornography. He'd been watching internet porn regularly since puberty, and that left him unable to connect normally. He was unable to experience sexual release without either watching porn or mimicking things he'd seen in porn." Another woman wrote, "I have been in a relationship and married for going on 6 years. He watches porn and has an addiction. He cannot perform and isn't sexually motivated. Basically, no sex." Also, women discussed how partners wanted the women to act out pornography. One of those common effect of pornography is that men wanted to act out scenes from pornography and the women didn't like it. One woman wrote, "They want insane positions, props and costumes, all those extra things." Another woman wrote, Our sex life degraded as the internet grew. As his porn addiction grew, so did his demands on me. He wanted to use sex toys. He wanted us to watch porn together. I tried each a few times and hated it, so I refused. Next up, he wanted me to wear lingerie, and not the pretty kind, but the degrading, kinky kind. I tried a few times, but felt disgusted. Then women talked about overt violence. This was the most serious effect of pornography on their relationship. 12% of respondents said that the partners were violent and or raped them, and they attributed the violence to their partner's use of pornography. One woman wrote, "I was 14. The boy I dated asked me to do phone sex with him, and he knew a lot of positions from pornography. By the time I was in my early 20s, my boyfriend insisted on tying me up and anally raping me." Another woman wrote, "They'd start trying to recreate scenes or moves with me, things that hurt, were uncomfortable, felt degrading. I started feeling used. Then one boyfriend raped me because of what he saw in porn. He said, 'The women in porn like it, so you should too.' It just got worse and worse. I started being upfront that I didn't date guys who watched it. Some guys told me that I'd die alone." Another woman wrote, "He found it hard to maintain an erection unless he was being rough with me. He was violent towards me, and he wasn't violent towards me at any other time except during sex. He acted like I was sexually broken because I didn't want to. I absolutely believe that this was due to his porn use. Another man I slept with held me down by my throat and spat in my face, and he said, 'I thought you'd like it.' None of this used to happen when I was younger, when rough sex wasn't so normalized through ubiquitous porn. Reading women's descriptions of being abused and assaulted as a result of the partner's use of pornography was sad, but what I found really frightening was what one woman wrote. There's no way to tell which men are normal and which ones are violent until you're in bed with them." I just find that horrifying. The violent behaviors the women described indicate that pornography has taught and trained men through masturbation that sex is violent, sexual violence. Then summary, in some ways the summary of all the comments were, pornography ruined our relationship. They gave details, but essentially that's what happened. And then he could not stop. What do women want? Several of the women talked about what they really wanted. They said, "I like loving, intimate sex with kisses on the mouth and sweet expressions of love and care. I want to have good sex."
Go find a woman.
Several more women wrote about the desire for loving sex. They said their partners engaged in loving sex before they turned to or became addicted to pornography. These aren't women who are anti-sex. They just don't want violence, acting out pornographic scenarios, or non-performing partners. One of the things I'd say is that all the women's responses about pornography, how it affected their relationships, were negative. Almost all the women said it led to the end of their relationship. Increasingly, we are seeing media focus on men asking what's wrong with men and boys. We need to point to pornography. We need to tell the journalists, the psychologists, the politicians to start asking men and boys about their use of pornography and how it is affecting their well-being and their relationships. Okay, next, Katherine Kinney will talk about how the respondents reported they unlearned pornography's lessons. Can you present from over there, or do you want me to come over there in advance?
No, this is fine. This will be easier. Thank you, though. If that's okay with the video. I want to apologize for the tech issues first off. I should have known that all weekend everything was going too smoothly and that was going to end. And I also want to note that Forrest made this PowerPoint really beautiful. And then we could not get it to be formatted right on this computer, so this is an old version. But thank you, Forrest, for your labor. So yeah, Forrest and Donna have sort of started us on a narrative arc that starts with women's exposure to pornography in childhood, often unwilling, goes through the impact on their relationships and other aspects of their lives. And I'm going to wrap us up with talking about what changes women's minds, what gets them to recovering from their own pornography use, unlearning what they've been taught through it, and how does radical feminism tie into all that. So as we were looking at this data, we noticed a lot of patterns and women mentioning the sort of this nebulous concept that included the unlearning, the radical feminism, the recovery, changing their minds. And this raised two questions for us. The first was, what is it that actually causes women to change their minds and become critical of pornography? And the second one is, what factors make it possible for women to unlearn what they have been taught by pornography, the men who use it, the porn-steeped culture. So the data set consisted of 16 responses explicitly addressing this issue. There were more that were sort of borderline, but these are the ones that are most directly addressing it. So women said things like, unlearning this forced sexual submission of women was a very difficult task for me and took many years. 5 responses explicitly referenced radical feminism. Sometimes it was as an instrument of change, and sometimes it was just as a reference point. So they said things like, I found radical feminism, and it woke me up to the harm and danger porn-fueled men were causing me. Or they said, even before I was introduced to radical feminism, I had started to suspect that porn was bad for my sex life. So the patterns we identified in this data set. First of all, there are basically 3 reasons that women stop using pornography or become critical of it or unlearn patriarchal messaging. These can be split into 2 categories, individual and collective. So the first one is that women have individual negative experiences. They start to notice themselves self-objectifying, objectifying other women. They start to notice they're having bad sex. Not abusive sex, but just bad. They're not enjoying it. Then there are the social or the collective experiences, which are split into 2 parts. So the first is men's depraved behavior as a wake-up call. They see men wanting violence, veering toward pedophilia, and that sort of wakes them up to what is actually happening here. And the other one is, the other collective experience is women somehow showing them another way. And this is the one I'll be focusing on because I think it's most interesting and also most understudied. And I should also say, often there's a lot of overlap. Women don't just have one path, it's some combination of this that leads them out of it. So an Australian woman, ages 18 to 24, says, when the porn ban was implemented on Tumblr, I was annoyed because I felt it was wrong to control what kind of content people consume online. I saw a lot of Tumblr users expressing how this was a big step in the right direction. I then started reading anti-porn content through radical feminism, and at 17, I started to recognize porn as being harmful and unethical. I have not intentionally sought out porn in over 6 years. So there are 2 things I find really interesting about this response. The first is that this happened exclusively online. So there was no in-person women's connection. It was just purely online on an anonymous platform. But being exposed to women speaking and to radical feminism was sufficient to change her mind. And the other thing I want to draw your attention to is the last sentence. Because one of the things we noticed was a real disparity. There were women who hated porn and wanted to stop being influenced by it, wanted to stop using it, but hadn't managed to. And then there were women who felt like they had come out the other side. And our observation based on this data set is that women who feel like they've come through it and healed from it are more likely to have taken the path of the collective experience that involves other women in some way. So just realizing, for example, that it's having a negative impact on you or that men are depraved is not necessarily enough for women to get through it. All right, another woman says from the US, 18 to 24, the only time I was free from porn was when I attended a women's only college. Having spaces to be around other women and being able to fully humanize myself and others was the only way for me to heal. Now that we're losing women's spaces, it is really hard for me to find a community that sees the dangers of the sex trade in all its forms. So this is a different version of the first one we saw, a very different sort of women's only space, in-person, all-encompassing, academic, intellectual environment. But still, she explicitly says that being around other women was what healed her and made her successful. And I also appreciate that she ties this to the issue of gender identity ideology. and the impact that the loss of women's spaces has on all sorts of elements of our lives, including our sexuality and being able to deprogram from the messaging we've received. All right, and our final example, learning about radical feminism was what began to liberate me from the shackles of pornographic trauma. I realized I wasn't alone in my experience. Many women had been through something similar, and pornography had done to me exactly what it set out to do to women. Groom us into submissivity and sexualized humiliation. Finally, my body is starting to feel like my own again. So again, we have an optimistic end note on this one, which we didn't see in many of the responses that didn't have this collective female component. And I also found this one interesting because she was only exposed to the radical feminist theory. She wasn't having conversations with other women in the present moment or being in women's spaces, but what women had written and said previously was still enough for her to get this sense of community and an ongoing struggle and be able to learn from those experiences to, start to feel like her body actually belongs to her. All right, so the conclusions based on this. First of all, anti-pornography advocacy should have some sort of collective female component in order to be effective societally, but also to have a lasting impact on women. So talking about the harms to self-esteem and your sex life, talking about what does it say about men that they want to watch and do this, that's valuable. But it seems like it's not going to be enough to actually help the women some of the women who need it most. This also highlights the importance of women's spaces in any capacity. Nothing is too small, from an online anonymous space to a basically separatist in-person experience. It's all valuable and important. And finally, we really have to share our own experiences, whatever they may be. It may not be a formal consciousness-raising group like we're so influential in the second wave, but anytime we can share our experiences, the evidence suggests that that's going to be very impactful for other women. All right, so now we'll just briefly go through, starting with Emma and back to me, and in just a minute tell you a little bit about what this was like for us working on this research.
So I was having a coughing attack through that, so then I started crying, which was that something. So for me, I have a queen of disassociation. So I would read all this stuff and be like, oh, and then later not be able to sleep and be like, oh, this is why I'm having nightmares. But also I had experience, I dated a porn addict, so this was old news in a way, and also kind of validating that this is kind of a universal experience, but then also we need to solve it. The action should have been yesterday when I was in college and we were talking about this. And, it's only been 2 years to affect a decade for it.
Yeah, it was an interesting experience. I think I've been reading about pornography for a long time, and when I was younger, I also had personal experiences in not that specific industry, but in that area of life, which certainly, solidified my position as an adult as a radical feminist. But I think that in some ways I'm a bit desensitized to responses like this. But regardless, it was emotionally grueling, and I had to go through the responses incrementally and take breaks and stuff. I think one of the most interesting pieces to me was what I touched on about sexual abuse that doesn't involve physical contact, because intuitively I always was aware that has really deleterious ramifications for development, but I had never seen it so distinctly presented as the impetus for actual post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. I thought that was really fascinating and revealing. And I hope we get to do this again soon.
Well, I used my paper and I included my reflections in my presentation. But I'll just emphasize one of the things that I mentioned, and that is we really need to have more public attention on pornography, more media focus on pornography. We know that it's just pervasive, that everyone is exposed to it, and a very high number of people are addicted to it, but and that is harmful, but there is just no mention. And just recently with the Charlie Kirk murder, we know that there is some relationship with the murderer to the furry community. You don't get involved in the furry community and become trans without being involved in pornography and social media. And yet that aspect of what is going on in society is just completely ignored. And I think that's certainly one of the things that we need to be bringing more to the public attention. The other thing that I'll mention, and that is that when we talk about this, we tend to go to the more extreme examples. Like violence, yesterday I mentioned the strangulation pornography, because it's so awful, it's so shocking. The thing that this woman said, you can't tell anything about a man, how violent he is until you're in bed with him. That is just so horrifying and shocking. And yet one of the things that we noticed and talked about, and that is how often the women talked about how really low-level things affected them. For example, one woman said that when she was just a child, she walked into the room and saw that her father was looking at pornography on his laptop, and she said, I never could see him the same again. I mean, just little things like that, we suddenly realize have this huge impact, and because they're not extreme, they're not violent, we don't discuss them. And in some ways, I'd like to go through this whole analysis again and focus only on the really small things and the big impacts that they have. Oh, and I guess I would also say when we're talking about future, what we could do in the future, I think this kind of research is really important. We did it as volunteers. I don't know, Ms. Katherine, you put up the original questions about it.
Yeah, and Brianna was involved with the other report.
So we can ask our own questions. We don't have to rely on someone else asking the questions. We can do that and put it out there as new knowledge.
And to that point, one of the things that surprised me about this was hearing women say things over and over again. And I also want to know, so we gave you just excerpts. A lot of women wrote a lot. They had a lot to say about this. And the stuff they had to say was recurring, but it wasn't something I or any of us had seen discussed elsewhere. Like Donna was saying about the very allegedly minor thing that completely impacts a woman. The other thing I found interesting and really depressing was how many women talked about how their experience with pornography, whatever it was, changed the way they viewed the whole world. Themselves, the men in their lives, but not just the people they're close to, like walking down the street. They have this cynicism about all of society, really, and it's just incredibly all-encompassing, and I guess that's one big takeaway. I don't think we can underestimate the influence of pornography on anyone. Questions?
Have there been any, maybe no, I'm sure there are, but any of these kind of surveys for teens and both boys and girls? So
I actually can't. I actually don't know. One of the things I would say is that if we go and find what is there, we need to be critical of it. We need to use a radical feminist analysis to look at the kind of questions they're asking and think about whether we need to ask different kinds of questions.
yes, I think this is exactly
It's not a survey technically in a like a clinical sense or an academic sense, but Peggy Orenstein has written a lot about teenage girls and boys, and her book, I think it's called Girls and Sex, is really phenomenal, and it has a lot of just her talking with middle school girls about sex.
So I just want to say what you think, this was really next and wanted to ask if the anti-porn worker would consider doing another project like this in specific reference to women who have maybe not even themselves been exposed to like strangulation porn or, you know, anal porn that whose partners have, and then are experiencing that in real life. Because I have it's very rare that I see a sexual assault agent in this situation has not experienced consensual strangulation, and then they have to go through the whole explanation of what, you know, that there's no safe way to do this. It's not possible. And so I would love to see that correlation of how many women are being exposed to this. It seems like they think it's not, like they really do, and it's just choking. It's limited choking is what they say. It's not. So I think that would be my biggest question, and then if there's a, and I don't, this is a really touchy one, but one other concern that I have is we're starting to see an increase in, and I think this is social media related, in parents who are producing child pornography of their own children, and then publishing it online. And I know some of that is like outside of probably the ability and the realm of the WDI, but I want to maybe just put that on his radar, and then that would be maybe great questions for the future.
Yeah, to both of those points, you know, we definitely talked about, I think there's interest among us on this panel, but also on the team who aren't up here, in doing more projects like this. The details TBD, but if you are interested in getting involved with something like this, reach out to us and do some brainstorming and figure out what we want to do next.
Resources, like we have resources, part of, I think, the limiting factor. Part of the limiting factor of this, at least, in my personal thing, is that because I am a part of groups of trauma survivors with sex addict and porn addict partners, is a lot of those spaces won't accept these surveys. So if you have an in with a group that would be open to this, and it's not like it's just more of a space where we don't want to be politicized. I think personally they might, but it's like you can't go into those groups and be like, hey, here's a survey. So if you have the resources, then please share it, at least if you don't want to be part of the group itself, but we're open to it if you have connections.
Yeah, I would just say that this is it's about 113 responses, and some of them are quite long. There's a lot of information in there, and there are a lot of different themes that we didn't touch on. We just had to take a look at this and say, what can we pull out and package a little bit to do one session at the conference. But there's a lot of information out there that we have not summarized or figured out what to do with. So that's one thing I think that I hope that we will proceed with. Plus developing other surveys. There's absolutely nothing. I mean, I think if you're trying to ask questions of children, that's a different story. But if you're just out there asking women questions,
Just to echo that, I think we could have spent all weekend talking about just the responses we got. There was so much we didn't touch on. The impact of male therapists as groomers, financial abuse that becomes cyclical. There were a few responses where women's husbands spent all their money on their pornography addiction or prostitution, and they didn't find out about it until their house was at stake, and then they went into sex work in order to pay the bills. And just this insane, horrifying cycle. Like, there's so much more available to research.
I'm wondering if you are finding that there are people that are going into organizations so on talking about just the issue of porn at all. I put together a workshop that I did in July, 2 different organization places that I went to talk about it, not because I'm an expert at all on it, but been talking in the last 2 years with younger women, and I could just tell that it was like traumatizing to them. And I would try to like say to them, you should like put together a workshop. And I could just tell that that was not, something that they could do. And I thought, well, this is something I can do as an older woman. I've done workshops on lots, throughout my life, my job, blah, blah, blah. And so I did 2 workshops in July. And one I did at the National Organization for Women, their national conference in July. And I put the workshop proposal in, and I thought, this is something they should be doing. But I thought, well, they won't do it because it was in Las Vegas. And they accepted it and went, and I did it. They had the co-presenters here with me, and we put together like a kick-ass handout and so on. And I didn't know if anybody would come, and women came. And I thought, well, they're going to bring up the sex work thing, because pretty much I'm having women talk among themselves. And we give them the information, all these great workshops. There's so much great information out there, and what you all are doing is excellent. Doing what you're pulling together. And people want to talk about this. And that was great, and then I did it the second time at the old Mishmash land in Michigan. Events up there, women came, and young women are there, and they're talking among themselves. And young woman said, I'm addicted to porn. And I said, if you're talking when it comes out, and I'm like, and she said, you're just working with a counselor. And I'm like, is this something you talk about in counseling? No, she's never brought it up to a counselor. And so it's so insidious, and I'm hoping that what we're talking about, it's not being talked about. In fact, as an older woman, I'm not an expert at all, but I can facilitate a workshop. I can put a workshop out there and see if anybody shows up, and then let it happen.
I just want to say, we all have different experiences, but even if you're not an expert, we've all been impacted in some way, no matter how minor.
Now let's remember the feminist method, consciousness raising groups. We get together and talk. Don't let degrees and credentials and things like that make you think that you can't do the work or talk about it. Also, thank you very much for doing that. And what you're saying is it just might be the point in society people are ready to start talking about it again the way they used to. One of the things that I learned a couple of years ago, and that is there was a session in an organization I work with about churches. And I keep thinking, churches, that would be a good place where they would talk about pornography. But what we had is we had presentations by people who knew pastors. Pastors are some of the most addicted people out there. So if you've got a pastor that's addicted to pornography, he's not going to introduce it to his congregation as a need to heal from it. So we've got to start somewhere.
Okay, so I was one thing I was just thinking is I feel like there needs to be an entire weekend's conference on this, not that WDI needs to do it necessarily, but like there's just really so much to unpack here. But on the topic of people wanting to talk about this, that is not my experience. And I have a tremendously difficult time talking about this. And both of you said, I couldn't help but notice, you both said people want to talk about this. Well, who are the people that want to talk about this? Because men don't want to talk about this. And in my experience, it's very difficult. Like, we can all use specific language and listen and hear each other. But I don't want to talk to men about anal rape porn. Like, that's gross, But even if we do, they get very defensive. Like, to the point of not even acknowledging that it's a thing at all. So I have just found this to be very difficult to talk about. If any of you want to address that.
I agree. It's extraordinarily difficult to talk about. I tried when I was in my early 20s and first started getting into Robert Jensen and Gail Dines and all of them. Talking with men about it was a very big mistake. I think you nailed it. Some people really do want to talk about it. I think women are very reachable in a lot of ways, although they can also get very defensive. But speaking of Gail Dines, she's had quite a bit of success talking to younger people about pornography, and I think a lot of them are very eager to talk about it because it's sex education for them. They're learning about sex through porn, and we do need sex education. We don't need the kind that's becoming entrenched in schools now, where it's teaching that kink is good and whatever. So young people, women, and hopefully someday men too.
also want to concur that even men that would be on our side, I have like breached the subject when it like comes up, and I've literally had them go, I like shut it down and be like, I don't want to know and I want to remain innocent, and I'm like, what? Like if you want to be a good guy, like no. So I'm with you, and even women, like some women want to talk about it, but like it said, some women want to talk about it in their bubbles, but they don't want to be publicized. Like they don't even want to take the survey because they're like, I don't even want to be anonymous in the survey. Like, I just want to be in my safe space.
All right, thank you all so much. See you in the ballroom in a minute.